Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's webinar on the history of the University of Michigan. Thanks for joining us tonight. Tonight we're going to look at a new book by our guest, Jim Tobin, Sing to the Colors, a Writer Explores Two Centuries at the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz. Before introducing Jim, I want to say that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the university were made possible by cession of lands by the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the college at Detroit so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of Indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. Now, I trust that many in our audience know the work of Jim Tobin. His graceful and engaging pieces about U of M history for Michigan Today, the U of M Heritage Project, and other publications have given a lot of us many pleasurable and enlightening moments. We're fortunate to have Jim with us tonight to talk about a new anthology of his Michigan writing, Sing to the Colors. And I want to say that it's not only great to have this set of pieces all together in one place, but the framing that Jim has given this collection in introductions to the pieces and in the prologue and so forth is really a wonderful weaving together of reflection and recollection, and to borrow one of his own phrases, a web of connections. James Tobin is professor of media, journalism, and film at Miami University in Ohio. Educated at U of M, where he earned a BA and a PhD in history, and served as co-editor of the Michigan Daily. He spent 20 years as a newspaper reporter and freelance writer. Among his books are Ernie Pyle's War, America's Eyewitness to World War II, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, To Conquer the Air, The Wright Brothers and the Great Race for Flight, which the Wall Street Journal named one of the 5 best books about invention, and The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency. In the classroom, Jim's special interest is narrative nonfiction, both historical and contemporary. He is also the author of 3 books for children. So welcome, Jim.
Thanks very much, Gary. Great to be here.
So as we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this has been a week of revelations at U of M, one of some upheaval, I suppose, perhaps no little anxiety and even some shame, but also not without new hope. And one of the things, Jim, that seems to me this anthology reminds us of is that Michigan is not just one story, it's many stories. Not all of them good, not all of them bad, but in this sort of plurality of stories, some are still to be discovered, of course, some even to be written. Maybe there's a cause for resolution and hope, and maybe a call to all of us to pick up our figurative or literal pens and do some writing about the future of U of M. And I expect maybe you have some thoughts about this.
I do. I'm always nervous as a historian saying anything about the future, because historians will be the first to tell you how often predictions fail to come true. But I've been as sad as any alumnus about all the things that have happened, and yet I think the historical point of view does always provide some solace. We are not just creatures of the present. We are creatures of this long history in whatever community or polity we see ourselves in, including an institution like the university. Gary, it's a great phrase. It's a place of many stories, not just one story. No story overrides all the others. And so, as others better able to look toward the future than I do so, I do think that they and we can find meaning, find hope in what the university has tried to be over, more than 2 centuries now. And it has failed in ways that we have to take note of and be accountable for. but it's also had just enormous accomplishments and has meant so much in the lives of, you know, literally millions of people. And so we got to think of this as a whole, and that helps me anyway to see past these terrible events of recent times.
Thank you. I think we're going to talk more about what the university has tried to be over the years, but why don't we start next with talking about? I mean, so what's the origin? What's the origin of this book? I mean, say a little bit about how this came to be.
Well, I started writing about U of M history nearly 20 years ago with a couple of freelance pieces. I was a full-time freelance writer at the time, and I was looking for gigs. You know, I was looking for paid work. And John Lofi, the new editor then of Michigan Today, and a friend of mine asked me to write a piece about Avery Hopwood, the founder of the Hopwood Awards. I did that, and I liked the piece, and he liked the piece, and that sort of led to this idea to write a regular story every month for Michigan Today. And so that's how I kind of got going, and then that broadened as the bicentennial was approaching, and you and others were working so hard on that, trying to figure out how did the university want to approach its history at the time of the celebration. And so I got involved in telling longer stories, and that the number of those are the ones that are in this book. And then finally, you know, recently I just thought, as I get older, I don't, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that writing really lives only if it's in a book, right? If it's within the covers of a book. And I didn't like the idea, even though the story still lived online, of them remaining online. So I liked the idea, if the University of Michigan Press would go for it, of putting the stories together. Then you mentioned these essays that I wrote specifically for the book, as transitions, as introductions, as reflections at the end. That was really the idea of Fran Blue, and many in the audience know well, the former director of the Bentley, an old dear friend of my wife's and mine. And it was his idea to ask me, well, what does this all add up to? You don't just want to publish a collection of these pieces just as they appeared before. What are your thoughts about where you've been on this long journey of looking at the history of the university? And that seemed like a good idea. And although I very seldom write in the first person, I sort of stepped back and thought about how these things tied together, thought about my complicated love for the university and my family's long history with the university. And so I managed to put together some essays that act as glue for the different stories, and then try to make sense out of the stories as a whole, at least the ones that I've chosen to go into the book.
Yeah, well, it works very well, and I mean, I think the first person part of this is really compelling. But you talk a lot about your family too, so just give us a brief sketch of your family's history with U of M.
Yeah. Well, my both my mom and dad grew up in the Detroit area. My dad in Highland Park, and my mom in Royal Oak. They came to Ann Arbor and met in the late 30s, fell in love, and had the sort of classic Michigan romance, especially in that era, you know, going to J-Hop every year. One of my favorite pieces in the book is a kind of history, the long history of J-Hop, the central social event of the year for decades. I grew up hearing tales about those dances and the great music that was played there. And then my dad went off to World War II, luckily survived and came back and went to law school at Michigan afterward. And so that was, you know, in many ways the kind of the foundation of my childhood, the childhood of my brother and sister older than I, coming out to Ann Arbor from Detroit. And we were sort of steeped in that tradition. So it's always on my mind when I'm on the campus, and even if it's just in the back of my mind. So then I met my wife at Michigan when we were both starting graduate school, and went to Michigan myself, of course, and was deeply involved in the Michigan Daily, which which gave me, the journalist view of the campus, which was a wonderful way to experience the campus. I got to see a lot more of how the place worked than the average student does. And then I went to graduate school, and that was a whole different experience. I finally, instead of skipping class all the time, I actually went to class and studied hard and had close relationships with professors, including the closest one of all, Sidney Fine, who is, I think, the longest serving U of M faculty member. So that had a big impact on my view of the place. And then I covered the university when I was a reporter at the Detroit News. I really have seen it from a number of angles. And as I say in this introductory essay, I feel like, my life is this little skinny green vine that's sort of climbing around the interstices of the place. And the fact that my wife and I made our home here in Ann Arbor has had a big impact too. And then lo and behold, both of our daughters went to Michigan. So it's a lifelong thing.
And you mentioned, you said a moment ago, you used the phrase "complicated love." A complicated love story is sort of the subtitle that you put on on tonight's presentation. And so, I mean, just a little bit of reflection. Why, how complicated, and why love? I mean, where do those things come from?
Well, it's funny. I remember, Gary, back when we were, I was just one small figure among the many more important ones who were planning the bicentennial celebrations. But as we were thinking about the history of the university, and we were looking at I was looking at how other universities had handled their own history. And I spoke with a woman, I can't remember her name, who had recently been named the official historian of Rice University in Texas, great school. We had a frank conversation, and she was really enjoying her position, but she said, "No, I just have a warning for you that someone once said to me, never fall in love with the university because it's not going to love you back." Yeah, you do have to remember, I mean, it's a human institution with power relationships, and it can be a very tough place, especially for faculty and staff, competitive. So you can't pretend that it's an institution that is surrounded by this hazy maize and blue cloud, where only good things happen. I've been around long enough to lose that sense of fond nostalgia that I think many alumni feel when they don't live here anymore. They only have their memory of the place from when they were young. That's not anybody's real University of Michigan, and it never was. The university is a fascinating place. This is true of all schools, especially I think American schools have this kind of thing going on, where it is, we have such fond feelings about the place because we have fond feelings for when we were that age, as undergraduates. We treasure memories of our youth, the sugar-coated memories of our youth, and that becomes all bound up with the place itself. We don't want it to change. We know how much alumni hate it when a building comes down or is replaced, or the organization of the place changes. That's very hard because it's bound up with these deeply emotional memories. Anyway, and I also, for a little while there, I had a journalist's perspective on the university, and I was supposed to take this sort of critical, hard edge toward the place, and I did. And I made some people mad at the university. So that's still part of how I look at it. But I think this is how any historian feels when they get real involved in a particular subject, is that you sort of know an era or a biographical subject or an institution that you're writing about. You know it from stem to stern. Not that I know the university better than anybody else, I don't, but I know it pretty well. And so you get this, complicated, adult, multi-perspective on the place. And I mean, I remember Sidney Fine once, he was a great expert on the history of the city of Detroit. And we would talk about Detroit a lot in his classes because it was the subject of the research that he was usually working on. And he said to us once, he said, "Boy, Detroit may be a tough place to live, but it's a wonderful place to study." And, so, sort of what you could say about you and them.
Right. Well, in a way we know, right? I mean, in a real love relationship, it's not all about good. I mean, everything, every complexity is not a barrier to love. It's probably a way in which love finds itself
That's
becoming
absolutely right.
deeper. Yeah.
If it's not complicated, it's not very real.
Hmm. So, in terms of that, one of the stories in this book, which I think is in print here for the first time, is the piece "Remembering Mishigama," in which you're kind of reflecting and remembering your connection to this former U of M institution at a couple of points in your history and in the history of the university. And I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit of that piece with us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It was a nerve-wracking piece to write. And rather than preface it, I'll just read this first couple of pages from the essay. Then I'll talk a little bit about what happens in the middle of the piece, and then I'm going to read the end of the essay. This is the last piece in the book, and as you say, Gary, that this hadn't been published before. In the summer of 2020, "Remember Me" email dropped into my inbox from a guy I'd known at Michigan in the late 1970s. He said he'd been gathering materials to document the history of the old senior honor society called Mishigama, of which he'd been a member. He knew that just before World War II, my father had been the head of it. So he was asking if my family had any memorabilia that I might share with him. Mishigama was best known for borrowing the imagery, the white man's imagery, that is, of Native America, circa 1901, when it was founded. For decades, the club enjoyed a prestigious place in student life with secret meetings in a special room on the highest floor of the Michigan Union's tower. Members included Gerald Ford, the future U.S. president, Frank Murphy, a future governor of Michigan and justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, star athletes, leaders of student government, campus editors, all male. By the late 20th century, Mishigama's prestige had faded. I had a hazy memory that in some recent year, amid controversies over sexism and cultural appropriation, it had been thrown off the campus. I could think of only one piece of Mishigama memorabilia that my dad had left behind, an old black and white photograph, torn at the edges and mounted on burlap in a heavy wooden frame. The photo shows 40 young white men posing in 2 rows on the steps of the Michigan Union. All are shirtless, half sit in the foreground, muddy and bedraggled as if they've just been through some physical ordeal. The other half stand solemn-faced and superior behind the subservient row. Each man standing wears a headband with a feather. Even in the monochromatic tones of the photo, the skin of all these young white men looks strangely mottled and discolored. I knew why, because they'd been doused with water and smeared with red brick dust. One figure in the center stands out from the others, the Sachem, or chief, of the so-called tribe, quote unquote, of 1940-41. His cheeks are slashed with dark stripes. He wears an elaborate headdress of white and black feathers. My dad. He was president of Phi Delta Theta and captain of the tennis team, thus his Mishigama name, Singing Strings. After his death in 2005, the old photo in its frame sat for a while in a box in the attic, and then we took it out and stood it up in a bookcase. It was a curiosity, an odd fragment of family lore from another time. Look at this picture of Grandpa, this one here in the headdress. It was 1941, just before the war, and there was this honorary society. Now I was looking at the photo with new eyes. If I sent it along for some online archive of all things Mishigama, someone from outside the family would soon be looking at it too. Someone who did not know that my dad was a kind and honorable man and anything but a racist, as the word was understood in his time. Some stranger might soon be considering the parallel between this keepsake of ours and the repellent images of white men in blackface that had lately spread all over the digital universe, and of the Indian mascots and Indian names, the Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, that had been dropped in ignominy. The more I stared at the photo, the stranger it seemed. What did those young men think about this weird spectacle they were making? Where had this business of masquerading as Indians come from? My email correspondent knew one more thing about Mishigama and me, that as co-editor of the Michigan Daily, I too had been tapped for the tribe, and I'd accepted. So, along with pondering my dad's place in this pre-war tableau, I was trying to remember why, as late as 1977, I had joined an all-male society that purported to honor the campus's leaders, when I knew very well that many student leaders were women. What had I been thinking when I submitted to the water and the brick dust, the red equivalent of blackface that my dad had taken part in? And I was trying to remember why, just a few days after I was initiated, I quit. Then I go on and I fill the reader in on some more history of Mishigama, and I talk more about my memories of my dad's relationship to the tribe, some background on the long American business of what is called playing Indian, masquerading as Indians. And I talk about reaching out to a couple former members of Mishigama who I had known back when I was in school. And then I get down to filling in the later history and then to this last reflection. I often think of a little fable that one of my favorite professors at Michigan, Gerald Linderman, told us one day in a lecture. Linderman had been in the U.S. Foreign Service in Africa and India, and then came home to study U.S. history. He taught courses in the modern era. I don't remember the context, but the fable itself went something like this. The 20th century says to the 19th century, "You evil bastard, you enslaved Africans, tore them from their homes, divided children from mothers and fathers." The 18th century replies, I've got that wrong. The 20th century says to the 19th century. It's supposed to be the 19th century says that. No, that's right. Okay. And the 19th century replies, "We didn't think of it that way. It was natural. It was what we knew." Then the 21st century says to the 20th century, "You evil bastard, you married our mothers, stuck them in kitchens, suppressed their creativity, consigned them to second-class citizenship and sexual penury." And the 20th century replies, "We didn't think of it that way. It was natural. It was what we knew." Did the members of Mishigama cause pain to Native American people by playing Indian? Surely they did. Would any thinking person start the Mishigama of old in the 21st century? Of course not. But do we deserve to take a stance of moral certitude and pass judgment on the campus cultures of the past? We can do so, but not without first inquiring into them deeply to make sure we meet them on their own terms and see them as clearly as we can. The university is the accumulation of decisions made by imperfect people in their imperfect generations. Each generation cast off elements of the past and replaced it with new creations, and so it went era by era. So it must go if a worthy institution is to survive. So what would I do with the Rope Day photo in its dusty old frame, with my father at the age of 21 standing somberly in his faux Indian headdress? Should I throw it away as if it were shameful? Many years ago, members of Mishigama placed a plaque inscribed with a tomahawk in the ground near the Tappan Oak on the Diag. And then when Mishigama's use of Native American symbolism was declared to be unmitigatedly racist, the plaque was dug up and moved to a scraggly plot of grass behind the Bentley Historical Library on North Campus. Nobody sees it there unless they go and look for it. A few feet away on the blank back wall of the library, you can see the 1948 bas-relief sculptures titled "Dream of the Young Girl" and "Dream of the Young Man" that used to be affixed to the facade of the Ellison-A building on State Street. "Dream of the Young Girl" shows a sleeping girl conjuring the image of a young woman with two children who takes the hand of a muscular pioneer beside his Conestoga wagon. In the mid-2000s, administrators decided the image was anachronistic and sent it out to the Bentley. The economist Paul Courant, then U of M's provost, remarked at the time, quote, "My own general view about anachronistic statements of value is that you ought to use them as opportunities to teach. When possible, you'd like to have a display that gives people opportunities to reflect on what the world was like when the art was created. To me, Courant's point seems just right, especially at a university. The archivists of the Bentley Library don't honor such relics as the tomahawk plaque and dream of a young girl by preserving them. But they don't burn them in a ritual of renunciation either. The relics document particular moments in the university's history, which is itself one microcosm of our history as a society, imperfect, troubled, always evolving. The Rope Day photo represents a fragment of the world as my dad knew it in the spring of 1941. It was one slice of what he considered normal and natural. I loved him and I miss him. So I'll put the photo back in a place where I can look at it from time to time. It may remind me to take a dose of humility whenever I feel the temptation to pass judgment on the past.
Thank you for that reading and for those that the honesty of that reflection. I mean, it's so pertinent at this time when we wrestle in so many ways with how to apply our values in judging the past.
That's what I was just
And well, it brings us back, and it brings us back to the issue of complexity, right? And if this is going to happen, it better, one place it ought to happen is at a university.
Right.
It seems to me. One of the things you write, if I could just read just a sentence here, you say, "I never found a reason not to believe that of all our society's embattled institutions, the college and the university embody our best hope of living in a dominion of reason and perpetual renewal." And sometimes reason has some hard edges, right, and some difficult passages.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if we could, get a little bit philosophical, maybe even at the moment.
That's only appropriate for a philosopher.
Yeah. In many ways, I think your book sort of constitutes a kind of appeal that we not take the university for granted and not take for granted the values and the behaviors and the people who brought us to this moment in its history. And it seems to me that there are three things, many things, but there are at least three things that kind of shape something like Michigan. One is what's its purpose? What is its purpose? Two is who has access to it, and the third thing is what are those kinds of norms and value that allow it to achieve its purpose for those people who are a part of it. So that's a little long-winded, but I wonder if you could just take off from that point and talk about maybe some of those things in reference even to some of the stories in the book.
Well, there's no question that access is and will continue to be a major theme of the university's history. I mean, and talk about complex. It even goes back to the time when only white males were attending the university. There were class issues in who attended colleges and universities that we have sort of forgotten about. So access was an issue, definitely an issue in the 19th century. There are several stories in the book. And I'd written more beyond those about the long effort of women to find a proper place of equity and equality in the university. It was fascinating to me to learn over the years just how independent the first women who attended the University of Michigan were, how little the university attempted to supervise their lives. That degree of supervision that was very much in full force by the time my mother was at the university as a student in the 1930s came about because of women, deans of women, who felt that these young women needed greater supervision. More women were attending university who were not driven by career aspirations in the way the earliest women largely were. So that got complicated. Many more women were attending the university by the 1920s and 30s, and yet their lives were segregated from men, strictly routinized and supervised. They were in a wholly different position than men were. Another story that just transfixed me. I practically stole it from our colleague, Kim Clark, who has written very extensively about the history of the university. She said, "Did you ever hear about this thing called the Negro Caucasian Club in the 1920s?" And I said, "The what?" And she told me about this fascinating small society of Black and white students who formed in the teeth of the racism of administrators and the racism of many faculty members, and asserted the goodness of the benefits of members of the white community at the university and the Black community, the tiny Black community at the university, having concourse, getting together, talking, getting to know each other. That's a powerful story to me. And it happened in the 1920s, 40 years before these issues came to dominate headlines. So, yeah, I'm not responding to your question very well, Gary, except to say that these stories are just, rife in the university's history. You could talk more than I about the Bentley Library's recent efforts to uncover the histories of Black students, to document their lives. The great librarian Margaret Leary, now retired from the law library, has been a leading volunteer on that effort. And this is an amazing sort of historical and archival project. So the Bentley is more than doing its part on this front. And now I trailed away from the question. What do you?
Well, that's okay. No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, you're right. I mean, the African American project at the Bentley, which is approaching completion. I think it's an important move on the part of the university to be supportive of that kind of effort. Now, you mentioned the Negro Caucasian Club. I mean, this is a wonderful example of students taking the lead, and a fair number of the stories in this book are about students. And you use the phrase at one point in your introduction. You talk about students behaving badly, which some of them are about students behaving badly. But on the other hand, sometimes you look back at different points, and even students who were engaging in activities that we today would find laudatory, because they made U of M a better place, were probably seen as behaving badly by some set of administrators or adults or parents or whatever. So just some reflections on the impact of students on this institution. Yeah.
It's one case after another. There's a little story about James Angel, a great 19th century president of the university, who taught international law, and he is reaching for a definition of a precedent. Okay. And he says, when you fellows, and of course he was speaking to almost all male students, when you fellows beat a path across the grass of the diag, he says, I know that we should put a sidewalk there. We should pave that because you have chosen what is the best way to walk across. I always think of that. There's a great incident in the university's history that I wrote about a couple of times, but did not include in this book. And it's the famous, John F. Kennedy speech about the Peace Corps on the steps of the Union. Well, what I discovered in exploring that story was that all Kennedy said on the steps of the Union very late that night was a kind of invitation to U of M students to get involved in world affairs. Would you engineers go to Ghana and give your time to people in Africa who need our expertise and so forth? He didn't say, how about we have a Peace Corps? It was two graduate students, married graduate students, Alan and Judy Guskin, who went over to Cottage Inn late that night and said, let's see if he's serious, and started to circulate petitions, and then took the petitions to Kennedy and one of his aides, Theodore Sorensen, I think. When they came back a few days later and were landing in Toledo, they present him with these petitions and say, we're on board, Senator Kennedy, if you're elected, will you bring this about? And he said, well, I'll talk to my guys about it. And sure enough, he came forward with the actual Peace Corps proposal. That was students who drove that. Time and again, I mean, the best example of this in the book is a story called The End of Ours, Hours, If there are alums listening who remember U of M in the mid to late 60s, they know about the revolution in dormitory rules that came about because students demanded an end of these restrictions, largely on women, and on the visitation of students, to students of the opposite sex visiting dormitories and students' own rooms. So I went to college at U of M in the mid to late 1970s, in a place was very different to be a freshman and a sophomore than it had been 10 and 15 years earlier. And that legacy goes on today. Not always for the best, I must say, as an old, dad type who sees much to frown upon in the way that undergraduates behave in the dorms. I see this up close, both at my own school, Miami, and at Michigan. Something was lost when that old in loco parentis regime ended, but we're not going back.
No, that's right.
And it was students who brought that about. It wasn't administrators saying, gee, we better loosen up on these fine children.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, one of the palpable things in the book is just place, right? The sense of place. First of all, of course, these are all stories happening at U of M. They're not happening someplace else.
Sure.
But again, in the stories themselves, but then again in your introductions and so forth, you connect things to a lot of different places that I'm sure, again, a lot of the audience would know. So I just wonder, what are reflections about what is it about place that makes it so important? I mean, you talk about even, here we've been through 2 years of a pandemic where some of the trends away from in-person education got accelerated out of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
What's lost? And and then after that, maybe what are some particularly resonant places for you at U of M?
Sure. Well, it's true. I start the book talking about my conversation with Fran Blue, and this was early in the pandemic, and we were sitting well distanced on his back deck out in Northeast Ann Arbor, and talking about this, earthquake that had happened where on college campuses, where all of a sudden all the teaching was remote, and you stroll through the diag and there was no one there. And it was very much the same down at Miami. And I was teaching all of my classes online. I think we're still trying to come to terms in higher ed with the impact of all of these months that we've been through, and now all these semesters, and it's still going on. I was struck immediately by how again, it's hard to put words to, but there is something in a good classroom, a well-run classroom, where the professor knows what he's doing and the students are engaged. There's something magical that goes on. It's true of any school, obviously, but it's true of college in certain ways. There is a meeting of minds, and it happens in person in a way that is very difficult for it to happen in this digital space that we're occupying right now. This event right now would be different if we were all sitting at the Bentley Library together, and folks were looking at me and I was looking at them. And I almost never lecture. The exchanges that I have with students are in small groups and very informal and in discussion. And boy, we aren't to a place where the digital sphere replaces that. So that's one sense of place. It has to happen in a physical realm where people are seeing each other and talking with each other. And I would argue that that's true at a research university too, where so much of importance goes on among faculty colleagues who bump into each other in the corridor and who go out to lunch together on State Street. They run up to Red Hawk, and all of a sudden very important things are being discussed about their discipline. In the labs, of course, in the medical school, these are places where humans work together, live together, fall in love with each other. Just all kinds of stuff happens in these places that are tied to the physicality of it, and just not to be denied. So there's also just sort of the physical specificity of the place. Anyone from any campus thinks back to particular places where they were turned on by a book, by a professor, by a fellow student. I mean, for me, I've written about my time at the Daily elsewhere. I didn't include it in the book, but for me, the physical space of the newsroom at the Michigan Daily and Student Publications Building on Maynard Street, that's one of 2, 3, 4 most important places in my whole life. On my deathbed, I'll have images of the Daily in my mind, and it's because friendship, working together, happen in those spaces. And so, I don't know, you'd have to talk to a psychologist and anthropologist to really get a handle on this. It's not for a historian to address. I just know how palpable and real it is for me.
Right. Well, so much of it is what you were talking about. I mean, it's this serendipity that can happen when people are physically co-located, right? That doesn't happen with online events that have to be scheduled, right?
Right.
I mean, they have to be scheduled in order
you have to choose.
in order
It's
to
a
happen.
deliberate thing, right?
Yeah.
That old virtual sphere called Second Life, which I never hear anybody talking about after all.
No, right.
Yeah. So I don't think we're there yet. I remember Jim Duderstadt once saying, who was a great futurist and thought deeply and I'm sure brilliantly about the future. But he was talking one day out in the future. It's amazing. He was predicting what the things that we might be thinking about given our realities now. He said, imagine 2 holograms talking to each other, a student and a professor. They don't need to be in the same place. Well, maybe so. We're working on it up at North Campus.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, it loses some of the texture. It loses some of the senses, right? Which are
right.
which are part of an experience.
Right.
So we're going to open this up to questions from the audience in just a minute, and I'll just remind the audience you can enter your questions into the comment or chat section on YouTube. But before we bring in the audience, I want to talk a little bit about the writing process. I mean, what to you makes a good story? What are you finding when you say, oh, this is going to be a good story? This is
I'm very sorry, Dr. Krebs, but you have to pay tuition for that information. Enroll in my course at my university. Yeah, I mean, this is what I spend my life thinking about, worrying about, trying to achieve. But it's a great question, and actually, even people who, like I'm sure all of our audience is true of them, even though we all love to read, we love stories, both fictional stories and narrative non-fictional stories. There's a lot to the kind of craft of putting a story together that most folks aren't sort of aware of, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Don't claim to have mastered it by any stretch of the imagination. So I'll say what happens when I get that spark, that says, aha, this is a story. Sometimes it's a character. There is a spectacular collection of oral history interviews at the Bentley with members of the law faculty. And one day I was looking for something else in a box, in these boxes, folders, transcripts of these wonderful oral histories done quite a number of years ago now. And I saw Yale Camisar's name. Yale Camisar, major figure in the history of the law school. I opened it up. It was actually technically closed. I wasn't supposed to look at it, but it was right there in the box, and other things in the box were open. So I pulled it out just to read it. And this character came to life, as if in a hologram. I mean, I just heard and saw Yale Camisar, who you probably met, Gary, and is one of the larger than life figures of the U of M faculty. And so that character, I just thought, I've got to write about this guy. Got to write. I've met him once before, actually, but now I learned more about him, and I saw that there was a story to be told there because his character was so large. Sometimes it's what we call what screenplay writers will call an inciting incident. Okay, something that touches off a change in the status quo. In the case of the End of Hours story, it might have been if I had happened on a Michigan Daily story about a little student government council at Mary Markley Hall saying we're going to change the way women's hours are run, or the way penalties are handed out for women who break the rules. That touches off a whole series of incidents that leads to much bigger consequences. So that's the start of a story. I tell my students, look for somebody who wants something very much and pursues it, but then runs into difficulties and obstacles. When you see that happening, you can usually follow that train of events through to the climax and the resolution of that wish, that powerful wish. Sometimes you find the resolution first. I don't know if I can think of a good example, but you sort of look at some significant event that has happened, and you think, well, what led up to that? Who drove that? Who drove us toward that? That then can become a story. You've got the end of the story. Now find out what the beginning was. So those are some of the constituents of storytelling.
So are there any stories about U of M that you wanted to tell, but the historical record just wasn't there to really get to the nub of it, or anything along those lines, or stories you'd like to work on that are on the horizon for them?
Well, I'm always sort of, scrambling for the next idea. I'm not one of these writers who has an enormous store of ideas just ready to go. I wish I were. Usually it happens through one accident or another. Well, I can tell you about a problem like that nagged at me for years, and then ultimately I did write about. And it was that story about women and the dorms. Where did the dormitories come from? Why, in the early 20th century, did the university start to build dormitories for women, when for nearly 50 years, women students had lived in boarding houses like the men, had been quite happy about that. Very happy about it, actually. There were alums of the women alumni of the 1920s who looked back and said, I can't believe what has happened to the women around here. The university has cracked down on them. So I tried to figure out the answers to that question, and it took me a long time, partly because I didn't have the time to devote to it, but it led me to the papers of the first deans of women, who were the ones who instituted these rules, names that will be familiar to every University of Michigan alumni, because their names were Mosher and Jordan, Eliza Mosher and Myra Jordan. The first deans of women. Myra Jordan especially is the one who cracked down hard and said the women are going to live in dorms, and they're going to have a lot of rules to supervise them, because they need those rules. Let's see. Right now, I'm working on a story about a very significant event in U of M history that I'd never written about before. It's the great 1965 Vietnam teach-in. And I thought I'd be writing about students. Well, this was a student thing, right? I didn't really know much about it. I had images in my mind of students attending these all-night seminars. Well, that's not really the story to me. The story lies with the faculty. It was a small number of liberal, I'll choose that word deliberately, liberal faculty who were outraged by the escalation of the war in Vietnam by Lyndon Johnson, whom they had all just voted for against Barry Goldwater. He had promised to keep the war, on a low key, and then he escalates. That leads to the teach-in, and that teach-in led to many, many other teach-ins, and was a significant spark in the whole anti-war movement. And that happened here. So just finding out about that, going through interviews with some of those faculty, most of them now dead, has been fascinating.
That's great. So it's a wonderful collection. And are there one or two that of these pieces that are really special to you?
Oh gosh, Gary.
I know it's not a fair question, but
I know that our pal Kim Clark, who has been my editor on many of these stories, one of her special favorites is a piece that in the book is called When Heads Rolled, and that is a story of law quad. It's about the wonderful, most of us would just say they're gargoyles. That's not technically the right architectural term. These stone figures of the faces and crunched up bodies of 6 of the university's presidents that appear overhead in the main archway into the law quad. And so there's a funny little story about how William Wilson Cook, the great benefactor of the law quad, a very strange man, gave a ton of money and then insisted that he have control over every single aspect of building those buildings, even though he never visited Ann Arbor either to watch their construction or to see them after they were constructed. He died before the law quad was done. Again, the law librarian, Margaret Leary, who wrote the biography of Cook, knows a lot more about this than I did. But when I found out about how some of those heads were hacked off at Cook's order, I thought, well, that's a story I've got to tell. So that's one that I had a lot of fun with.
I really, by the way, I was thrilled when I first saw that story, because I always loved walking through those arches and looking at those corbels. It was just wonderful. I appreciate that one. Sorry, go ahead.
Never ceases to amaze and surprise. If folks haven't been inside Hutchins Hall, the classroom building of the law quad, you got to go in there and look at the amazing. They're really cartoons in stained glass. Cartoons about student life. It's one of the architectural gems of the whole university. Oh, if I could pick one more. Oh, I know what it is. So, we're all great Michigan sports fans, right? Well, count me out. I've never been much of a Michigan sports enthusiast. Strangest man who lives in Ann Arbor, and I spend my Saturday afternoons in the fall happily working or reading and thinking, oh, thank God I don't have to go to the football game. So I wrote a story called 2 Against Football, which is about a man who became very well known in Michigan later, Neil Stabler, an important politician and the congressman at large from Michigan in the 1960s, a great Democrat, and a very young professor named Robert Cooley Angell, who was descended from James Angell. Mm-hmm. They opposed Fielding Yost's big campaign to build the new stadium, to build the big house. And they said, this is not what this place is supposed to be about. And if you build that stadium, it will forever enshrine the idea that college is about circuses and gladiators. Basically, this will be a great monument to that idea. And of course, they were hooted down and defeated. One of I think it's a Stabler grandson who is a great guy, wrote to me right away and said, well, thanks for the story, Jim, but guess what? My grandfather used to love to take me to Michigan games on Saturday.
That's great.
Neil Stabler remained a Michigan fan in spite of his early apostasy.
That's great. That's great. Well, we have some questions coming in, and I think the first one is maybe a wonderful way to start. What was your favorite menu item at Drake's?
Oh God, well, that's easy. Cherry chocolate cordials. Now that's so. I went into Drake's mostly to buy the candy. I didn't eat lunch at Drake's very often, although I love thinking about my parents who went on so-called Coke dates to Drake's. It was fun in the 70s and 80s, and we're into the 90s. My wife and I would go to Drake's and remember my parents having been there. My parents loved to tell stories about Drake's. Boy, it didn't look very different than it had back when they were going. But I loved those candies, the cordials. You can't get cordials. Well, you get those big fat kind of gooey cherry cordials. But these were little cordials with this little liqueur type liquid in the middle of them. Long answer to that easy question.
Oh. So you write about Drake's in the piece that's on campus hangouts, which again is another important part of being at a place, right? Being in the places that you gather.
Yeah, for sure. And everybody's got their own favorite. The 3 that I included in the book were Drake's, the Pretzel Bell, which was surprisingly hard to find good documentary evidence about, but I finally did find some anyway. And then Dominic's. Too long a story to tell, but I have a funny little story about a professor at Miami who got his PhD in math at Michigan, and when I first joined the faculty at Miami, he said, and met him, he said, well, how's Dominic's doing? and he told about how he would work on his very abstruse mathematical dissertation in the basement at Dominic's.
So another question. Thank you for your views of U of M history and your willingness to include your own history, which enriches our own understanding. What do you think? What do you think about the lack of activism regarding voting rights at U of M?
Well, it's a travesty, and it's maybe the most important issue in my book that we have going today. So I'm not even though I live a few blocks away and I'm on campus a fair amount, I don't know much about activism or the lack thereof. But we all ought to be getting on our horses and riding to the rescue on the voting rights issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Activism does seem on campuses to go in waves. I mean, there are periods of much more intense activism and then periods that are more quiescent. But,
there's no question about it. And that goes all the way back too. You can see it come and go, as it does in American democracy generally.
Yeah, right. Why is the book called Sing to the Colors?
When I was trying to think of, like what would be this good U of M phrase? And I thought of this. I didn't want to pull a phrase from the Victors, or at least I couldn't think of any line from the Victors that would work. And I didn't want the book to seem too rah-rah. It's not what the book is like. On the other hand, it's a pretty rah-rah title. So but what I was really worried about was the question of whether anybody would, or how many people would recognize it. So I went to I think I asked both of my daughters, both U of M alums, one in her 20s, one in her 30s. I said, so Sing to the Colors. Does that mean anything to you? My younger daughter said, no. What is that? So this is a person who did not go to University of Michigan football games. Okay. I went to the games as an undergraduate, every home game. I want to defend myself on that score. She was one of these, anti-sports types. She'd probably never heard the Yellow and the Blue sung. I think it's a kind of a lyrical phrase. In a way, it's a testament to my father who loved the Yellow and the Blue. I love that song, and I wrote a song about. That's in a story. I didn't write a song. I wrote a story about blue, about the blue color and its history at Michigan, and the part that played in that song. So yeah, it's partly just sentimental, partly because I think it's kind of lyrical and nice. And I hope, most readers of history are, shall we say, a little on the older side. They're more in our generation, Gary. And I think those alums know the song.
Yeah.
And we also use I don't know if they even do this at football. I haven't been to a football game in many, many years, but do they still play the Yellow and the Blue at the end of every game?
I have to confess I haven't been either, but I think they must. Maybe somebody in the audience can confirm.
Yeah, they'll know.
That.
Sure.
So another way, Robin Fleming's stature and legacy as a U of M president seems to grow with time. What makes him stand out?
Okay. I'll be careful with my comments about presidents. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's true that his reputation has grown with time. I actually remember Fleming being very well thought of in his own time. If anything, Fleming was castigated by people outside the university community as too liberal, too soft.
Yeah, well, like Spiro Agnew, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Literally Spiro Agnew. I think now, at this distance, Fleming looks good for good reason, because he was an adroit manager of conflict. His background was in labor mediation. He was a labor mediator. And so he knew how to get people talking with each other to solve problems. I wrote a new piece for the book about the BAM strike, which I hadn't written before, and it actually is somewhat critical of Fleming. But he certainly managed that very difficult event in a way that prevented violence. That's important because some campuses did go through violent exchanges, and he looks good, I think, in that role. Fleming, I can't say that I knew him, but as a student journalist, I interacted with him sometimes. And then at the very end of his life, he was out at Glacier Hills, the retirement community, when my dad was there. And my dad was a labor lawyer, and so they would talk labor law sometimes. And from early to late, Robin Fleming was a genial, kind, deeply intelligent, but a very approachable academic. Something you can't say about a lot of academics or academic leaders. So he was just a good man.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Jim, great talk. Do you have thoughts about changes in U of M's PR strategies over the years from your perspective as a daily editor and as an historian, as well as changes in access to documents from our time?
I can't speak to the question of documents. I was mostly a feature writer as a newspaper reporter. I wasn't the investigative type who was constantly sending Freedom of Information requests. So I just don't know about that. I'll tell you, U of M may seem buttoned up in its approach to journalists these days and in its whole PR approach, but it's a lot more open than it was when I was a student reporter. I can tell you that. I remember that the director of the news service had a stated policy. It's just laughable. I'm not going to mention his name. That his staff members would not return reporters' phone calls. That was the news service at the University of Michigan in the 1970s and even into the 80s. So things have changed a lot in that regard. I think U of M worries too much about its image. I think that institutions of higher education should be absolutely as transparent as possible, and it should not pretend that bad things don't happen in a big institution like this, or try to, I don't know. Yeah, don't get me started. I'll really get up on my journalistic high horse. But yeah, I think the notion of image and branding is far too prevalent at most. It's true at my school too, at Miami. So I get tired of that real fast, and I think places of higher education should not think along those lines.
Right. So here's one from our friend Fran Blue. Jim, great presentation. Say you were asked to select 3 stories or moments for U of M freshman orientation to give new students a sense of the complexity of the place. What might you suggest? That's a perfect Fran Blue question, I think.
That's a great Fran Blue question. Now, Fran Blue, you want to talk about somebody who knows the history of the University of Michigan?
Yeah, exactly.
Where you'd agree, Fran's probably in the lead position there.
Right.
Has taught courses on the university, longtime director of the Bentley. So, Fran, it's better to bounce that question back to you. But let me pick a couple. Now, one of them is a story that Fran himself is responsible for. It's called The Making of Michigan. This is a story that Fran originated. It's about several great social scientists at Michigan in the late 19th century, which may sound dry as dust to people, but it really does establish. Fran was really writing. This is a piece that he wrote for the Michigan Quarterly Review about these individuals as kind of creators of Michigan's academic position and prestige in the world. John Dewey is the best known of these figures. So Fran and I talked about it, and I said, what if we co-wrote a story that goes more into sort of the biographical details of these, what is it, 4, Fran? 4 people. And so that's what we did, and that story is in here. Fran gets the major share of credit. I sort of humanized these characters and wrote about them as people, but also about their ideas. So that's one I would pick. I guess I would say, for inspiration, I would ask them to read the story called Earth Day Eve. This is perhaps the best example of all of students doing something so profoundly important. Really, the creation of the great institution of Earth Day came about because of a few graduate students at the University of Michigan in 1970. So that, boy, if you can't be inspired by that story for what to do when you're a college student, then you're really not paying attention. And then I guess I would go back to the first part of the book, which is called The Place Itself. And Gary, we've talked about place. And asked them to read the story called Professor White's Trees, which is about professor of the 1860s, Andrew Dixon White, who came to Michigan from Yale and said, "I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to teach these frontier students in this small little college that I've decided to come out to. But it's so bare here. I'm used to this wonderful elm-strewn campus at Yale. Let's make it look like that." And so on his own, with his students, he started to plant trees. And I will say that one of my favorite stories ever, just published in Michigan Today last month, about the Tappan oak and how it will survive in a new form because a wonderful student picked up some acorns and grew some saplings from the Tappan oak. That tree was a full-grown, massive oak tree when Andrew Dixon White planted elms up and down the Diag. So that's how far back the place was.
Right. Well, I think those are three great stories. I think it's a great idea too to have them be part of first year orientation. I mean,
Well, we
it's a
should
wonderful
sell
way
them.
to
I
introduce.
think the admissions office or orientation office should say we're going to buy a copy of this book for every entering student.
Yes, excellent. Well, you have my endorsement of that. Definitely. So I think we're going to wrap up, but I wonder if I thought your epilogue was wonderful in the book, and this idea of the web of connections, and I wonder if just in closing, if you could say a little bit about just kind of talk about this idea.
Well, I don't know when this occurred to me, and not that it's so brilliant, but it still sticks with me. Sometimes it's fun to play these little games, these little historical games. So I figure we haven't mentioned, very important in the history of the university, key in the history, is Henry Philip Tappan, the first real president of the University of Michigan. And so I was thinking, how am I connected to Tappan? I, a student of the university. And so I sort of go back through Sidney Fine and his major teacher in graduate school, and then that guy's teacher. Not all of them taught at Michigan, but all you can sort of show this string of connections all the way back to Tappan. And then I said you can play this game with other people whom Tappan hired and what that led to, and then what that person led to, and so on. Well, that's what the institution really is not that we're all connected to him, Tappan, but that we're all connected to each other. And the institution, the university, is no more than people talking to each other. I think I make that point. That's another reason why the physicality, I think, is so important. Sure, we're talking to each other now, but it's different when you're in person. It just is. And so that's all that needs to keep going. And yet how precious and fragile that can seem.
Yeah.
Would we start the University of Michigan now if it didn't exist and invest in it the way generations have? I have my doubts. Yeah. So at least let's protect it. Let's perpetuate it. Let's fix it. Let's fix what's wrong. There's always been stuff wrong with the university. Let's keep going by our own lights and make it better as we see fit.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. So, Jim, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. Really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and your reflections, both in the book and tonight.
Thanks.
And again, I want to remind the audience it's Sing to the Colors.
Show that map, that 1920s map.
That's right. Yeah, that's a wonderful. Whoops.
There you go.
Yep. It's
really you can sit and look at that map for half an hour.
Absolutely. And just as a plug for the Detroit Observatory, which will be opening sometime in the months ahead, we do have a version of that map that'll be on the wall. So come here and look at it. All right. So anyway, thank you so much. I want to thank Lara Zeeland for her as usual, great behind the scenes work for the webinar, and the Michigan media team, which managed the tonight's event. And thanks to the audience. This session will be available on YouTube with full captioning in about a week. Next month, Making Michigan, we'll be joined by Deirdre De La Cruz from the History Department, who will be here to discuss the variegated history of U of M's connections to the Philippines. So please stay tuned for more information. Until then, please be safe and stay well, and good night. Thank you.
Thanks.